Hello, my friends. When we hear the word incarnation, we think of the second person of the Blessed Trinity becoming man. But do we really think about what that means? We know that Jesus Christ took on a human nature and that he was like us in all things but sin. But when we hear the word incarnation, does our imagination go at once to the truth that God's becoming man was an actual moment in human history? The church is at pains to remind us of this by giving us the name of the Roman procurator under whom Jesus was executed. And she reminds us every Christmas at midnight mass, when the Roman martyrology is proclaimed, locating the incarnation 752 years since the founding of the city of Rome, and in the 42nd year of the reign of Caesar Octavian Augustus. Now, I can take up all of our next speaker's time talking about how God's entering human history changes everything. But I want to call your attention to something my friend Rod Bennett says at the start of his talk. The Catholic Church is an historical church. It begins and continues without interruption throughout human history. The Catholic Church is the only Christian church to make this claim. All the others have one version or another of the same story. At some point, the church fell away from Jesus' original design, and at some point, somebody figured this out and corrected the course, whether his name is Martin Luther, John Calvin, or any number of their thousands of imitators. Now, how these so-called reformers manage the history is of interest to Catholics because their accounts, which typically include some conspiracy or another, don't really bear much scrutiny. And if you know their version of events and where they do not add up, then you can help our Protestant brothers and sisters to the fullness of the truth. Apologetics through history. What could be more exciting than that? Because in the end, what kind of history are we talking about? Salvation history. I know you will enjoy Rod Bennett's talk. He's a great storyteller, and he has an easy East Tennessee accent that will make you want to pour a little glass of whiskey and settle in for a great story. And if you want to dive deeper into these questions, go to shop.catholic.com and pick up a copy of Rod's book, The Apostasy That Wasn't. Thanks for watching. Keep Catholic Answers in your prayers every day. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and be sure to hit the bell icon to find out when we will release the next talk in this series from our 2019 conference.
What I want to talk about tonight, and it is related to the topic at hand this weekend and very much related to what Tim said because he kind of stole some of my thunder on the Marian issues, but I guess I'll get by. I want to talk to you about something that I think has not been commented upon enough in the world of Catholic apologetics, and that is the role that conspiracy theory plays in most anti-Catholicism. In fact, I might go so far as to say that it's the central idea at the heart of non-Catholic Christianity. Now, that may take a minute for me to make good on that idea, but ours, if you think about it, is the only form of Christianity which doesn't teach some kind of falling away or great apostasy or the church went off the rails and had to be put back by this person or that person or some other person. You get to pick. Ours is the only church, even very old and venerable institutions like Eastern Orthodoxy or whatever, ours is the only church that says there never was any great apostasy. Rogue bishops didn't carry off the church, et cetera, et cetera. We've been under the same management since day one, and there's no... There's no great apostasy. Nobody had to set our church right. We don't look back to, now, of course, don't misunderstand me. In another way, the church always has to be set right. I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said, I don't worry so much when people tell me that the church is dying, because the church has died and risen again many times, because she has a God that knows the way back from the grave. Not bad, huh? That Chesterton. So in that sense, yes, the church is always dying and rising again, and there's always someone like St. Francis or Athanasius himself who God chooses to come along and rebuild my church, as he said to St. Francis. So that's a permanent office. But the idea that the gates of hell prevailed at some point, that the Holy Spirit fled and left the building like Elvis, that's a very central idea in almost every form of Christianity except Catholicism. And if you think about that, that's something you can grab hold of and latch on to in doing Catholic apologetics, speaking to other kinds of Christians. And so I'm going to try to make good on that claim tonight. I was asked early on if I had a laptop that had my notes and things, and I had to confess that I am a man of the 20th century. I have brought paper. So you can enjoy it as an antiquarian show, even if the content is not interesting. But Christianity is a historical religion. In fact, the essence of Christianity is historical. Many other religions could get along just fine without history, without the history of their movement or whatever. They teach a set of tenets or a set of doctrines or principles. Things like you could have Confucianism without Confucius, and Buddhism would go along just fine without Buddha. But Christianity is the religion of history. It exists. The Catholic Church exists for no other reason than to perpetuate, by word and by sacrament, a set of historical events, to keep the memory of things, a set of things that happened in time and space, in a certain place, at a certain date, with a certain interpretation attached. The church exists for that purpose, to perpetuate the memory of the good news. That's what the word gospel means. That term, good news itself, is rooted in history. There was a time when we didn't know this, and then afterwards we knew it. So that is the essence of the church, is history. So this is why this idea is important. Conspiracy theories, the conspiracy mentality, attacks our ability to know anything reliable about the past. I mean, the essence of it is an attack on the knowability of the world around us. And if you think that this resonates a little with things that have been happening in current events, fake news and all of this alternate truths and all of this sort of thing, that's the essence of all of this, that there's an attack being made on the knowability of history. I think it's probably not coincidental that Mr. Henry Ford, who is famous for having concluded that history is bunk, as one of his famous quotes, it's probably not a surprise that he was both anti-Catholic and pretty strongly anti-Jewish, because Judaism is the Christian church, BC, so to speak. So it's interesting. History is bunk. Well, if history is bunk, you and I have got a blank slate. We're not accountable to anything that happened in the past. We can reinvent the wheel every day to suit ourselves. But at any rate, that will go more into this as we go. But conspiracy theory, the resort to conspiracy theory, is an attack on our ability to know anything about the past, which is absolutely connected with the essence of the gospel, the good news. If you can't know anything about the past, then you can't know anything about Jesus. You can't know anything about the apostles. You can't know anything about any of that. And for people who feel that way, it often turns into kind of an upper story head trip, a piece of existentialism. The name Jesus as a kind of a mantra to be repeated over and over again. So now let's pause just a minute to define our terms a little bit. What am I talking about when I talk about conspiracy theory or the conspiracy theory mindset? I don't know if anybody's ever walked you through it before, but it is true that there's no absolute proof for anything. I don't know if you've ever thought much about this, but if you encounter somebody who's resolutely determined to deny something that you're trying to give them good news about, or bad news about, or whatever, a piece of information you're trying to impart, there's no such thing as absolute proof. You think, well, surely, okay, there's absolute proof that that the sun is in the sky or whatever. Well, it might not be the sun. It might be a spaceship that makes light for the earth. It might be aliens, you know. I'm not saying it's aliens, but it might be aliens. Okay? Or at last resort, about any fact that you wish to deny, you can always say, well, you know, maybe when I saw that thing. Many people say, well, seeing is believing. If I could see a miracle happen in front of my eyes, or if I could see God write the words, I'm here, I'm God, in the sky, then I would believe. That's no absolute proof. Somebody might have slipped LSD in your drink, you know. And many people do hold that. There are people who are literally willing to say, even if I saw something like that, I wouldn't believe. I would doubt my senses. I would say somebody's pulling a con on me, or that somebody's using virtual reality to fool me, or I could be in a coma and dreaming all of this. So we concede that there's no absolute proof that can resist this treatment. But the truth is that nobody ever asks for absolute truth. Nobody ever needs it, absolute proof. Nobody ever needs it in real life. What we do, in fact, nobody ever asks for it about something that they're not in denial about. We never ask for absolute proof unless it's something that we are resisting, that we don't want to believe or to accept, or that rubs us the wrong way, et cetera, et cetera. What we do is that we ramp up the level of proof that we demand in proportion to how much we dislike the implications of a certain set of ideas. And you can always ramp it up one more level. We have, I'm afraid, in this sad world of ours, Apollo moon mission deniers. We have Holocaust deniers. We've got lots of deniers. The Flat Earth Society is doing a big business these days. I've been told that the Flat Earth Society within the last few years has started new chapters all over the globe. Or so they say. Okay, but the point is there aren't any, Washington crosses the Delaware deniers. Why? Because nobody really cares anymore. Okay? Except ordinary people who like Washington and see no reason to besmirch his character or his record, right? Okay? So there are no societies, denying that Cleveland, Ohio was founded on a certain date or whatever. When you begin to see these conspiracy theories sprout, it's always about things that people don't like or would wish to deny, facts that would cause them to rethink their entire outlook on life if they were to accept them. Almost invariably, the Apollo moon landing deniers are people who hate anything that aggrandizes or makes large the reputation of big government. And it's absolutely true that the Apollo moon program was an example of big government. Holocaust denial, well, we needn't go into that nasty subject very far. The people who are Holocaust deniers who demand, no matter what you present, no matter how well you answer their questions, they always ask for the next level of proof. Okay? Why do they do that? Because they hate the thing that the Holocaust implies. and they can't accept it, and they wish to whitewash it. So the flat earth thing currently. And let me say that there is some sympathy to be had for some of these folks. The world has gotten awfully complex. There are an awful lot of spin doctors out there, people trying to spin us. And I think the flat earth fad these days represents people who are kind of tired of being bossed around by facts, if you see what I'm saying. You're not the boss of me, you scientists and you cameras, You're not the boss of me. I think that's probably the essence of it. You're not the boss of me. What we're looking for, never, an honest person is never looking for absolute proof because you never need it. What you're looking for is a moral level of proof. You and I are looking for a level of proof which should satisfy somebody who doesn't have an axe to grind on this topic. Okay? A moral level, meaning that if I were to ask for more proof beyond this, it would imply something a little sinful about me. So that's what I mean by a moral level of proof. And that's what we look for all through our lives. We've never really looked for absolute proof, and it's a fool's errand if you do. So now, you can get into a conspiracy mongering mindset. I know people who have that mindset. I've had sad experiences with personal friends of mine, people who just developed after a while a taste for bad doctrine in Christianity. They just seemed to prefer it better than the real thing. And it didn't matter that they were gathering one bad doctrine from here and another from there that were contradictory. There was something about the exoticness of it that made it more interesting than what they grew up with, etc. Also, there's a conspiracy, a taste for conspiracy that I do think at times reflects somebody who's had sad experiences with having believed something with insufficient proof. And therefore, they develop a kind of an epistemological crisis in their lives. And they're always looking for the secret history, the truth that's been suppressed, that's been hidden from you. Any article that starts off with we need to show you the history that was always kept out of your history books and stuff. Well, you know that when somebody starts out that way, they're appealing to this taste, this appetite for the conspiracy theory mindset that resents being bossed around by facts. Now, I can sense, and I think maybe that there are some out there who might be asking, well, okay, Rod, you reject all conspiracy theories. You don't believe that any of them are ever true. Of course, some of them are true every now and then. What I will say this, as a rule of thumb, similar to the moral level of proof, as a rule of thumb for getting along in life, if you make it your policy to disbelieve every conspiracy theory that you hear, you're going to come out way ahead. The odds are way in your favor. You're going to win 99.9% of the time, which is pretty good odds. If you can get those up the road in Vegas, take them. Okay? So if you make that your policy, you'll do good. And of course, many of us have heard Chuck Colson's famous reply to those who thought that the resurrection of Christ was a conspiracy theory. How many have heard Chuck Colson tell that story? You guys don't run in those circles, do you? Chuck Colson, who was, of course, the famous Watergate hatchet man, Richard Nixon's conspirator who had the job of playing dirty tricks on Nixon's enemies. He said after he went to prison and found Christ and had a completely different life, he said, I can tell you that conspiracy theories are so hard to keep together that you can pretty much discount all of them. He said, I was involved in a massive conspiracy theory. Okay, I was putting over a massive conspiracy. The stakes were very high. If one man jumped ship, there was a pretty good chance we were all going to jail, which is in fact what happened. So the idea that the 12 apostles all got together and said, hey, why don't we make up a story that Jesus was resurrected, that an angel came and turned the stone away, and that they all, took a blood oath and agreed together to keep mum, like Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, He says, I can tell you, Colson says, I can tell you it doesn't work that way, There were something like 40,000 people personally involved in the Apollo moon landing program. Personally involved. The Apollo denier has to insist that conspiracy of 40,000 people keeping mum has gone on for 50 years now, an anniversary we just celebrated. And and Colson says we couldn't keep ours together for 5 months. So there's a lot to gather and gain from that particular story. But you will do pretty well if you keep clear of conspiracy theories. And in a way, as Charles Colson showed, our faith stands or falls on whether something like this happened. In other words, did the 12 apostles get together and agree to tell a lie to the world? For the greater good, of course. Did they? Well, if they did, then our entire religion is based on a lie, which we can't stand for. Of course, we don't. We believe that the Holy Spirit has guided us into all truth, as He promised to do. Well, let's look at this for a moment in the light of the history of the church. Conspiracy theory in this form has been with the church from day one. And, you can read about this in my book. Hopefully there's not a slide yet with me on it. Book commercials, I guess, are just part of the deal at things like this, aren't they? This new book called Scripture Wars is just out today. I hadn't even seen it until today, so I'm a little bit excited about it. So I may quote from it a little bit. But the earliest appearance of conspiracy theory in the history of the church happened while the apostles were still alive and working, and they were considered to be the conspirators. Who's heard of the Judaizers? The book of the Galatians is written against the Judaizing heresy. The Judaizers were those who said that the apostles divided over whether we had to continue to keep the Jewish law, the Hebrew laws of Deuteronomy, whether we had to continue to do that or not. Paul and, of course, the apostles at the first council of Jerusalem, dealt with the issue. Well, the Judaizers said, well, there was a division amongst the apostles over this. But at any rate, some of the apostles went too far, threw the baby out with the bathwater, misunderstood the message of Christ, and forgot that perfect keeping of the Hebrew law is incumbent on Christians, that we all ought to be keeping a Saturday Sabbath and eating the kosher foods and all the rest of it. And they accused the apostles themselves of a conspiracy to hide the fact that they had lied about this Jewish matter, that there was a great falling away, a great apostasy that happened before the ink was even dry, if you see what I'm saying, almost literally. That was the Judaizer heresy. The heresy of the Gnostics, which Tim mentioned earlier. The Gnostics, the very name Gnostic has the idea of a conspiracy theory in it. The word gnosis means knowledge, but as they were using it, it meant we're the ones who have the deeper knowledge, the deeper traditions. The Catholic Church, the apostles, are just the ones who have kind of a surface level knowledge, but they didn't really understand it. In fact, in one place, the Gnostics refer to themselves as improvers of the apostles. They basically said that Jesus taught a deeper message than these unlearned fishermen could understand, and they quickly fell away. You got to look for that falling away phrase, because that's the key phrase for the whole thing. And of course, we mentioned it when my friends were pushing my Apostasy that wasn't book, the great apostasy that so many believe in, that Constantine invented the Catholic Church, that the church was unrecognizably changed when the Roman emperor allowed himself to be converted, and that Constantine essentially created Catholicism and led the church away from its early simple roots into the kind of pagan hierarchy with statues and Mary and all the rest of it that we see now. This is an extremely widely believed idea. In fact, one of the first questions you probably get asked if you mention that you're Catholic to not even theological people, just people that have read Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, or people. This is a very widely believed idea now. Whether the Da Vinci Code, most people know that was fiction, but at the same time, the idea that Christianity, as it came to exist in later centuries, was completely different than what it was for the first 300 years, is the great apostasy of Constantine, according to a lot of folks. And of course, many examples of this: Seventh-day Adventism, as Tim mentioned, Mormonism. These things are explicitly based on the idea that there was a great falling away, that the Holy Spirit was lost to the church through this falling away, and these dark ages began that were because we had allowed this great apostasy to happen. But it was a big moment in my life when I realized that almost in fact, as far as I can tell, every form of Christianity of Protestant Christianity has an implied conspiracy theory in it. In other words, it has to have, if you think about it. If what I was taught in my church is different than, we all know that the Catholic Church was at large and in charge for 1,000 years at least. And if what we believe at my local evangelical or Protestant church is the truth, as of course we know that it is, then that implies that somewhere the apostles, they knew the truth, and we know it now. So if the Catholic Church started teaching very successfully what she teaches, then obviously some kind of great apostasy happened. Never mind that you're arguing in a circle. We know that the early church teaches what we teach now. But every form of Protestantism essentially implies a great falling away at some point. Some of them finesse it a little better than others, but it's implied there in every form of it. So, in reality, if you look at the history of what actually happened at the time of Constantine, you see that so much of it is just nonsense. And if you have trouble with this point, if you have serious questions yourself about this, or if you have people who do, I really am going to give you another commercial for a book of mine, The Apostasy That Wasn't. Not because it'll save you having to listen to me rant about it take time out of this speech to explain it. Every single plank in the Constantinian apostasy theory falls to pieces if you look at the facts with any kind of effort at all. Constantine wasn't even the first Christian emperor. He didn't make Christianity the official religion of Rome. He did not suppress all other forms of Christianity that disagreed. He didn't even suppress paganism. He didn't even the form of Christianity that he did suppress, Arianism, he only suppressed for about 1.5 years, and then he got tired of suppressing it and let him come back. Then Constantine's son, Constantius, actively sponsored this supposedly suppressed religion for 25 years after his father's death. So if you, just the most cursory, look it up on Wikipedia sort of account of the facts, shows that most of this is nonsense. Codswallop, as our English friends might say. None of that is anywhere true. Catholicism, if you look at it, was the great roadblock to the paganization of Christianity, as a study of the life of St. Athanasius will show. But what's the best proof? I may step away from the podium. I'm not going to put on a Swaggart-like performance such as we saw from our previous honored guest. I couldn't do that even when I was a Protestant, and I have not brought a sweat rag, so but I may step away from the podium. Okay, all right. The best way to refute, if you want a simple Cliff's Notes way to refute the everything changed after Constantine theory, the best way to do it is acquire some little knowledge of the church fathers. In other words, if Dan Brown says the divinity of Christ wasn't taught in the early church, I could give you hundreds of quotes from the early church where the divinity of Christ is being taught. So that idea is completely exploded. You know, it's only ignorance of the actual content. Well, first of all, ignorance may be of the existence of the early fathers. I had it myself for a long time. I had no idea. It was the beginning of the end for me in Protestantism. But when I encountered in a Protestant bookshop volumes that contained the writings of the early church fathers, and there were like 8 volumes, big, thick library books filled with multiple column fine print of writings, not a word in the books written later than 200 AD. And then many more if you want to continue it to Constantine in 325. Never dreamed that such a thing could exist, and most people who try to pitch a conspiracy theory like this never dreamed that it could exist, because if you go and look at it, you would have never come up with such a nutty idea. You have to go back to the Judaizers and the Gnostics and believe that the conspiracy started from day one, that the great falling away happened before the Lord was even out of sight at the ascension. You honestly have to believe that. As Tim so well expressed, we've got prayers from the 220s, 240s AD calling Mary the Mother of God. That you need to nail people down. Okay, if Constantine changed everything, if Constantine is the one who created Catholicism, be specific. What did Constantine change? Did he start teaching this stuff about Mary the Mother of God? Well, if that were true, we wouldn't find the quotes that Tim gave us from 107 AD, a prayer calling her the Mother of God from the 240s. We wouldn't find these things. So it's exposed. It's the end of it, you know. Did Constantine introduce this idea of bringing relics into a church, you know, having dead men's bones in your church, you know, a very scandalous idea for people who make visits, as I did as a Protestant missionary, make visits to Catholic cathedrals in Mexico. They're full of dead men's bones. Now, the men aren't dead. You and I all know that. Yeah, amen. But this surely is paganism, right? Surely. And yet we find written in the martyrdom of Polycarp, a book which dates from about 255 AD probably, we find at the end of the book, after Polycarp's disciples have witnessed his martyrdom, after seeing him burned alive, they say this: "We afterwards took up his bones, more precious than costly stones and more excellent than gold, and interred them in a decent place. There the Lord will permit us, as far as possible, to assemble in rapturous joy and celebrate his martyrdom, his birthday, both in order to commemorate the heroes that have gone before and to train and prepare for heroes yet to come." Well, this is 200 years, close to 200 years before Constantine. So what exactly are you accusing Constantine of? They won't be specific. Is it, so it's not Mary, it's not relics. How about bishops and the papacy? The writings of the ante-Nicene fathers in the 100s and 200s AD are full of submission to the bishops in the line of apostolic succession from the apostles, and tributes to the papacy. We've got Cyprian in 251 who says, "There is one God and one Christ and one church and one chair founded on Peter by the word of the Lord. It is not possible to set up another altar or for there to be another priesthood besides that one altar and that one priesthood." This is 75 years before Constantine. Okay? No, the number is correct. I said 251 AD. I didn't drop a 1, not 1251 AD. Okay, which is what I always believed about all of this, that it was medieval invention. The church fathers knew about this problem of conspiracy theory, that we'd be accused of creating conspiracy theories. We can go to Irenaeus, who's talking about Gnosticism. We have judged it well to point out, Irenaeus begins, in what respects the very fathers of this fable, Gnosticism, differ from among themselves, as if they were inspired by different spirits of error. For this very fact, the divisions amongst the heretics, forms an a priori proof that the truth proclaimed by the church is immovable, while the theories of these men are but a tissue of falsehoods. As many as they are, they all depart from each other, holding so many falsehoods, so many opinions as to one thing, and bearing about their clever opinions in secret within themselves. At one point, Tertullian, writing about 200, says, okay, let's grant that the apostles fell away, the early churches fell away. You know, the great and glorious churches of Rome and Antioch and Ephesus. Let's grant that error crept in, et cetera, et cetera. Is it reasonable to believe that error crept in and they all went to the same error? He says, could they really have fallen away into a unity of faith? In other words, they all decided to follow their own opinions, and when they got done doing it, the result was that they all agreed about Catholicism? Daniel Webster is supposed to have said that one of the best, let's see, I can't see very well anymore. That's one of my problems with these kind of things. Let's find out what Daniel Webster said, huh? Well, this is good. This is really a paraphrase of Tertullian. Webster said, Daniel, not Noah. You guys do know the difference, right? Daniel Webster said, falsehoods not only disagree with truths, but they usually quarrel among themselves. And could you ever, and I say this charitably as a former Protestant, is there a better picture of this than Protestantism with a capital P, everything that is included under the umbrella of Protestantism? That they all quarrel, not only disagree with the truth, but they quarrel amongst themselves? How could you see it any better than that? Well, I will take another break to rearrange my notes. You guys are very charitable after a very professional presentation like that. I have one more major point to make here, and that is this, that the whole power of conspiracy theory rests in the fact that you can't really argue with it. You know, the whole idea behind conspiracy theory is that there are no facts and that they've all been hidden. And you've got to find a pure source, okay? And the pure source means somebody that agrees with me in my way of reading the truth. So, but this is something that I would challenge your friends with, and that's this. It is, if they believe. Well, for example, we've used the letters of Ignatius to show that the bishops and the hierarchy were in place in 107 AD. I've actually had evangelical friends come to me and say that they'd concluded that the Catholic Church forged the letters of Ignatius, that there was no Ignatius and that the letters were invented in the Middle Ages. Okay? Well, you can't argue with conspiracy theory. You know, if anybody ever tried to argue with a conspiracy theorist, two things. One, you'll usually find that you will get your butt handed to you to begin with. You really will. If you try to argue against Apollo denial, for example, you'll find that this person knows everything there is to know about Project Apollo, and you don't. And the reason he knows everything about it is that he thinks about it all day long. and you don't. Okay? So you can't really, I think it was Chesterton that said, don't try to disprove a conspiracy theory. It's even a psychologist will tell you you have to pop it like a bubble. I've tried to help some of my friends who are really stuck in this. I had one friend that came to me with the idea that Pope Benedict's niece is being held somewhere at gunpoint. And he was trying to recruit me into this. And I said, buddy, if I'm going to become a conspiracy theorist and get into a conspiracy, it's going to have Bigfoot or the hollow earth or something cool in it, you know? If I'm going to be a conspiracy theorist, you know? And honestly, I do try to tell some of my friends, I sometimes ask them, and I found that this really does work. I ask them, how did you decide which conspiracy to believe in? Give me an honest, straight answer. When you picked your conspiracy, why didn't you pick UFOs or Bigfoot or the Vril Society or something? Why was it this particular one? And sometimes that will illuminate the point, that they've got some sort of axe to grind that the conspiracy theory is an expression of. But let's say, as Tertullian did, let's grant that the churches all went astray. Could they go astray into one error, all go astray into one unity? What I have learned to ask is this to my friends who say, well, the church fathers were just early Christians who went off the rails, just like we have early Christians that go off the rails now, implying that, yes, there were people who had Catholic-flavored ideas in 107 AD and 200 AD, but they were amongst many. There were other people there who had Baptist ideas or Jimmy Swaggart-like ideas or other things that were all there at the same time. So there were people who kept to the truth, and then, there were people who had started to drift in the Roman Catholic sort of direction. And what I usually ask them is this: okay, go back to the early fathers. Name for me one father that you would accept as a teacher at your church today. Name one that you would allow to teach Sunday school at your congregation. And they can't do it. They'll say, well, they'll give you examples of early fathers who said evangelical-sounding things. We admit that they say evangelical-sounding things. If they'd listen, they'd notice that the Catholic Church often says evangelical-sounding things. Okay? But they also say the Catholic-sounding things. There is no evangelical church father. There is no church father who sounds like a modern Baptist or Presbyterian or what have you. He might sound like it for a few pages, a couple of chapters, but he always spoils it by saying something nice about Mary or by talking about the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist or by talking about purgatory or something, you know. And thus he can't teach at the Baptist Sunday school, right? All right? So, but it sounds like a joke, but I mean it very seriously. If you have to say, what do you say if I ask you, pick a church father that you would allow to teach at your church? And there isn't one. Okay? What does that say about your church's teachings? That there's no evidence for it in antiquity. What does that say about your church's teaching? There's no escape from that short of conspiracy theory. You will find that if you bring them to that point, they inevitably will start spinning a conspiracy theory. That the Catholic Church, when it got in charge, scrubbed the records. You know, they gathered up all the writings of the Pentecostal and Presbyterian church fathers and burned them, you know. Even though there's no evidence that such a thing ever happened. Well, there can't be. That's the essence of a conspiracy theory. There's no evidence. Okay? So what they will say is, yes, absolutely, it was all scrubbed away. Well, give me another example of this. Like, for example, we know that Arianism was condemned at the Council of Nicaea. We know that Constantine condemned it. We know that Arius was banished. We know that the heresy was eventually defeated and driven out of the empire. But there's nothing else. There's 150 years where they talk about hardly anything but Arianism. Yes, it's true that Arius's books were burned in the year and a half that he was banished. They let him come back after a year and a half. Okay, but it is true that his books were burned and banned for a while. But the writings of Athanasius and Basil and the two Gregories and the rest are full of, there's hardly anything but Arianism in those writings of that era. So the idea that evangelicalism could have existed and then been scrubbed so thoroughly in a way that these other heresies weren't. We get the whole story of Nestorianism and all these other things. But there's no battle against the evangelical fathers that happened that's been preserved in the history of heresy. There is no such thing. Okay? So you can't escape the fact that you don't have any evangelical church fathers without resorting to a conspiracy theory, which you can do, but the humble person won't. The humble person asks for a moral level of faith. He asks for a moral level of proof. That's all he'll ask for. And you begin spinning these higher and higher castles of conspiracy theory. If you do it, you can do it. But if you do it, you damage your own soul. Okay? The evidence is there in the pages of the writings of the fathers. It's there for the humble person. But I encourage you to be that humble person and to renounce the use of conspiracy theory against which there is no defense. And to get my book. But yes, Apostasy that wasn't, and the brand new Scripture Wars, which just premiered today. So they tell me that I am going to go and sit and sign books for a while. Why anybody would want their book defaced by me, I don't know. I heard when I came in here that somebody told me they were an apologetics geek, an apologetics fan, and that I was one of their heroes, that I'm a fan of, that they're a fan of me. And I went, man, you guys are a little bit pathetic, If I'm your fan, then you're a little bit pathetic. I'm sorry. Is it okay to insult your guest as your audience as your parting shot? I hope so. Anyway, God bless you all. Thank you for allowing me to ramble and lose track of my notes and not be able to see. And hopefully you won't refuse to invite me back in spite of it. Thank you.